Hello and welcome to the Tennessee Informer. I'm your host, Dave Vance. Our guest tonight is Joanne Bregman, advocate for enforcement and strengthening of our immigration laws. But first, if you have an announcement from a conservative organization that you would like to broadcast on this show, please send information to tennesseeinformer@tv.gmail.com the Friday before the show. If you want our state to stand up to federal overreach, the best way to do that is support the nullification process bill sponsored by Senator Bowling and Representative Holsey that they intend to bring back next session. Visit tncss.weebly.com, call to action, and sign the petition and download paper copies. Just follow the instructions on the website. Our senators and reps need to know that we want this legislation passed when they return in January. D.C. will never fix D.C. Only the states can fix D.C. The Gibson County GOP Reagan Day Picnic is Saturday, June 8th from 4 to 7 p.m. Tickets are $50 per person. May 25th is the last day to buy tickets. Ribs and chicken with all the trimmings are on the menu. The guest speaker is Mr. John DeBerry, Senior Advisor to Governor Lee and probably one of the better people on his staff. The event will be held 88 Spring Creek Highway in Medina, Tennessee, home of Alicia Owens. Visit the website, gibsoncountytngop.com, to get your tickets. Now to our guest. Joanne Bregman is a lawyer who began her practice in the field of public utility regulation and civil litigation in federal courts. Her professional path eventually led to providing pro bono services to families of children with disabilities and co-founding a statewide advocacy network to address the education of students with disabilities. In that capacity, Joanne served as governor appointee to the State Advisory Board on the education of students with disabilities and assisted in rewriting state special education regulations. For the past 10 years, Joanne has focused on issues and advocacy related to the balance of power between state and federal governments, including a focus on immigration issues. Joanne, thank you for being with us tonight. How are you?
I am great, and thanks for having me.
Well, tonight we're going to talk a little bit about some of the legislation that was passed in this past session, some things that need to be passed in the future in our legislature, and give people an overview of some of the different organizations and individuals involved. We're going to get right into this, and we have a slide here that we want to pull up that shows some of the different organizations that are involved with illegal immigration here in Tennessee. Some of them also involved with refugees, if I'm not mistaken. So Joanne, if you could just kind of fill in the audience about the different organizations we have on the slide here and what we need to know about them.
Okay, thanks. So what you see on, if you're facing the screen, the left-hand side, the affiliates of Unidos US, which Unidos US is formerly the National Council of La Raza, which was one of the primary advocates for immigration, legal and illegal, amnesties, sort of that flavor. But you can see Latino, Memphis, they're all over the state, and they've kind of grown. Centro Hispano, that's in East Tennessee. Ola Lakeway is in East Tennessee. La Paz is in Chattanooga. The Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, better known as TIRC, is headquartered in Nashville. They have TIRC Votes, where they've raised money, they endorse candidates. And in the box, those three organizations, Conexión Americas has a building in Nashville. The American Muslim Advisory Council is housed in that building, and the Tennessee Justice for Our Neighbors, which provides certain services to legal and illegal aliens, is also housed in the Conexión Americas building. And on the other side, these are the groups that are around our capital, influencing legislators, and lobbying all kinds of legislation. So, of course, you have the Tennessee Chamber of Commerce, which includes the Nashville Chamber of Commerce and all the other chambers of commerce, NFIB, which is the Small Business Lobby, and Americans for Prosperity, which we have a state chapter, Tennessee, Americans for Prosperity for Tennessee, as well as sitting under that national organization, Americans for Prosperity. So I just give you a little bit of information. It offers a perspective to get a sense of how active and how well funded some of these organizations are. But back in 2001, just a real brief history, the Nashville Chamber of Commerce took a grant from the Office of Refugee Resettlement called the Building the New American Community Grant. And the goal of that grant was to build coalitions and demonstrate to local governments how they could help immigrants and refugees better integrate. Well, shortly after that grant was taken, the guy who was the advocacy organizer for Latino Memphis, a guy named David LaBelle, came to Nashville and started Turk. Now, Turk they routinely lobby at our legislature. I can tell you that in their 2022 990, which is the latest one I found, they reported to have about $3.5 million in revenue. That's not even the total. That was, yeah. They have a freestanding building now in Nashville. They reported to have 24 people on staff, including interns. I mean, they're pretty stout. And then, of course, they went on to establish Turk Votes. And if you really want to get a sense and understand a little bit more about what they're doing with Turk Votes, endorsing candidates, you can go to dailyrollcall.com. That's our friend Kathy Hinner's blog, and she has really great information about all of that. But I think and that Tennessee Votes in 2018 reported $780,000 in their yeah.
That's a lot.
So they have a lot of money. They have a lot of money. They're getting it from various fundraisers, but also from foundations. Some of the same foundations that are funding some of the campus protests now. Then if you talk about like NFIB, Small Business Lobby, which I'm going to talk about more when we get to talking about the repeal of the Public Chapter 911 law. But, those are sort of your typical business type of organizations who very heavily influence our legislators. I do want to mention a few notes about AFP, okay? So AFP has a national umbrella. It's an AFP National. That part of AFP has a longstanding relationship with a group called the Liberate Institute, whose founder is Daniel Garza. Daniel Garza is listed as a board member of AFP in their 2022 990. So he's, as far as I know, still on their board. Well, Daniel Garza's Liberate Institute, among the other things that it advocates for, is it also advocates for an amnesty for DACA recipients, or what you would call Dreamers. So in 2019, Daniel Garza and the new state chapter director for AFP Tennessee co-authored an op-ed in the Tennessean newspaper advocating for finding common ground on immigration. That was followed with an interactive exhibit at the Nashville Convention Center featuring the Dreamers, because that is Amnesty for the Dreamers is a part of the Liberate Institute agenda. And anybody who knows anything about AFP National knows that the Koch industries that basically fund that are about more immigration and about legalizing certain components of the current illegal immigrant community.
Now, I think Tori Venable still is the state leader. And so we basically have our state leader of AFP, or our state chapter of AFP, working with Libra, which Libra is pro-amnesty.
Oh, yes.
And I find it strange that not long ago, another conservative organization had a anti-illegal alien rally in Nashville and had somebody from AFP speak. And I'm thinking, wow, you talk about a contradiction there. You're having somebody speak that's with an organization that has promoted illegal immigration. So.
And it was actually reported to me by somebody who was at that rally that the person representing AFP was actually talking about how overrun Catholic Charities was at the border and that they needed help. I mean, that's what was reported to me. I wasn't there, but that's what was reported to me. That was kind of
That's rich.
Yeah, it's an interesting take. Anyway, so why don't we talk about some of the bills that were passed or not passed in this last legislative session?
Before we do that,
Sure.
Turk, I just want to make sure everybody understands. I know you'll probably hit this a little bit more, but Turk is not just influencing Democrat legislators. Turk is influencing Republicans up there as well. They have their ear as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I sort of anecdotally, I would tell you back in, I think it was, I can't remember what year it was, 2016, 17, 18, but there, there were several states that filed a lawsuit to terminate the DACA program. Tennessee was, there were 25 states. Tennessee joined as the 26th state. That Herb Slattery was the AG at the time. And so that lawsuit had been filed. It was starting to move. And then there was an article in, I think it was New Yorker Magazine, but the director of Turk met with AG Slattery, and he did an about face. He withdrew Tennessee from the lawsuit and wrote a letter on his official AG state letterhead to Corker and Alexander, who was still in Congress, they were still in the Senate, advocating for passage of the DREAM Act. I can't explain it, but it's, yeah. So they definitely influence Republicans. And actually, I'll even share some other past history to that effect kind of as we move along, because it's really, it remains relevant. And I think it's something that people need to be aware of.
Absolutely. Legislation-wise, let's talk first about SB 2576 / House Bill 2124. This is by Senator Taylor and Representative Grills. It was supposed to enhance our anti-sanctuary laws. Let's talk about that legislation a little bit.
Yeah, and I think it was a good bill. I mean, I think it's also important to acknowledge up front, there are no silver bullets. There's no single answer to how to address illegal immigration in and to Tennessee. There are a lot of moving parts. There are different things but I think there are things that the state can do, which, we'll kind of get to. But there is no silver bullet. So there are pieces here and pieces there. And I think this was a good enhancement to the Tennessee anti-sanctuary city law. So, but I want to remind everybody, I think that there's not always good clarity on what exactly is a sanctuary city or an anti-sanctuary city law. What does it really do? So pretty much what it means is that jailers cannot obstruct cooperation with federal immigration authorities. And what that means is that when a person is arrested for committing a crime under Tennessee law, if once they get to the jail, they are either determined that the person is in the U.S. illegally or their immigration status cannot be determined, the jailer is required to communicate with ICE. If when they communicate with ICE, ICE wants to issue a detainer to have the jail hold that person until ICE comes to pick them up, our state anti-sanctuary city law says that the jailer has to comply with that. So the first version of Tennessee's anti-sanctuary city law was passed in 2009. It was had a very limited scope. Those were kind of the early days of these laws, so I think there are aspects of it that weren't particularly well developed. But in 2018, the law was revised. Poppy Petray, Tennessee Eagle Forum, did a lot of heavy lifting, lobbying on that bill. But the 2018 law, the 2018 bill that was ultimately passed into law, we might remember that Governor Haslam refused to sign it, so it went into law without his signature. But it broadened the scope of what constitutes a sanctuary policy, and it also included the mandatory detainer provision that was not in the prior 2009 law. So when you look, I also want to mention, it's another little tidbit. When the 2018 anti-sanctuary city law was being considered in committees, and it had to go through both the state government committee and the finance committee. There was a fiscal note. Patsy Hazelwood, House member, who was a member of one of the House finance committees, she did her level best to try to kill the bill in committee. And actually, she was one of only 2 Republicans on the House floor that ultimately voted against the anti-sanctuary city law.
Wow, do you hear that, residents, citizens of District 27? By the way, she has a challenger, which is Michelle Renault, who's been on this show, and I tell you what, I was very impressed with her. So you guys do have an option. You don't have to stick with Patsy.
Oh yeah, I think that her primary, I think Patsy Hazelwood's primary candidate is very formidable. And I also think that, we need some change. We need, there's kind of a club, if you will, that kind of reliably vote for these kinds of bills. And if we're going to change something, I think some of that needs to be broken up. Anyway, so this year's upgrade to the sanctuary city law, the Brent Taylor Rusty Grills bill, does align, and it reinforces the broadened definition of sanctuary policy that was in the 2018 bill, because it requires all law enforcement in all counties to interface with ICE, DHS, in order to effectuate the whole objective of the anti-sanctuary city law. So I think it was a good bill. I don't think it really had, we had the typical opposition from the Democrats, Turk, those organizations. But I think, from the Republican standpoint, it was well received. And I think it was a good bill. So I'm glad that they passed it.
And it'll be even a better bill if we get a new occupant in the White House, because that's one of the big problems is, you have to have somebody that will force ICE to do their job. Or I should probably say let ICE do their job.
Well, that's true. Yeah. That's true.
Now, a couple of, just so the audience knows, I'm still having some vision issues, so that's why I'm having to refer to my notes. Also, if you're on the chat line, if you have a question, you can ask a question, and I'll relay it to Joanne. Might take us a minute, but if you have questions, please ask them. We did have some success in repealing some bad pro-illegal alien legislation with the passage of a bill amended by Senator Roberts dealing with professional licenses. Talk about the repeal of Public Chapter 911.
Okay. So this is a very, I think this was an really interesting effort, and really one that I personally was glad to see occur. So in 2022, there was a bill sponsored by Senate Republican Shane Reeves and House Democrat Bob Freeman. And that bill said that state-issued commercial and professional licenses were no longer going to be considered a state public benefit, and that now anyone with temporary work authorization, which is issued by the federal government, would now be eligible to apply for these licenses. Of course, if you're applying for, say, a plumber's license, you have to be able to meet whatever standards or criteria are required to be a plumber. So it wasn't excusing any of that, but it was the actual access to be able to get these state licenses. Well, prior to the 2022, and that bill passed, okay? It was signed into law by Governor Lee. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But prior to that 2022 law being passed, anyone applying for these state-issued licenses, these commercial and professional licenses, had to either be a U.S. citizen, they had to either be a U.S. citizen or a qualified alien as defined in federal law. So a qualified alien could be a refugee, an asylee. There are whole categories of who is considered a qualified alien per federal law. So in 2022, legislators were told by NFIB, and this is what was being repeated in committee and on the House floor, that the 2022 bill would only apply to DACA recipients, that is the Obama program Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, even though you didn't necessarily have to be a child, upon arrival, or when you applied for DACA. So they were told it would only apply to DACA, and it would only apply to people under something called temporary protected status. Temporary protected status, or what we say TPS, is for individuals who might be in the country when their country undergoes some kind of event that makes it impossible or dangerous for them to return. So they come in under this allegedly temporary permission to stay. Those temporary permissions to stay, and it's by country, have been extended over and over and over and over and over again. So, they ought to change it to be named something else because it's not temporary. In any case, sorry, NFIB was telling the legislators this bill would only apply to DACA recipients and people under TPS. The problem was that was just not true, because if you actually read the language of the bill, it was an open door. It applied to anybody who had temporary work authorization. And actually, the bill didn't even say temporary. It was just people who are work authorized. But work authorization is a temporary it's a temporary permission. They're typically 2 years in duration, sometimes a little bit longer. The Biden administration is going through gyrations to take certain categories of work authorization and extend it to 5 years. And they can be renewed over and over. But in any event, the actual language of the bill said if you have work authorization, you are now eligible to apply for any of these commercial and professional licenses. Well, that big open door for work authorization meant it also would apply to the people being paroled in by the Biden administration that our Attorney General, Jonathan Skrmetti, had been joining lawsuits to sue over. So it was a little bit of a problem, if you will. One, because what legislators had been told or were saying or being promoted by NFIB and others simply just was not accurate. So anyway, let me quickly, though, explain immigration parole. Typically when people hear parole, they think of the criminal justice system. This has nothing whatsoever to do with that. So immigration parole is a limited authority that is provided for in the Immigration and Nationality Act. And what it does is it authorizes the government to allow entry to aliens who are otherwise inadmissible to the United States, but they're allowed to enter for a temporary period of time, either for a humanitarian reason or some kind of significant public benefit. The Biden administration, however, has decided to use parole to mass release people from the border. Consequently, many AGs, multiple state AGs, are filing these lawsuits challenging this gross abuse of the parole authority. So interestingly, last week, FAIR, that's the Federation of Americans for Immigration Reform, a great organization. I would encourage everybody to access their website, sign up for their newsletters. They're free. The information is fantastic. Anyway, last week, the executive director of FAIR was testifying in front of a House Budget Committee in Congress. And she was testifying in part about the cost of illegal immigration. She noted that the release of those on parole into the United States are one of the main sources of the cost of illegal immigration, of driving up the cost of illegal immigration. In any case, people who are released via the parole authority, they are immediately eligible for work permits, Social Security numbers, Obamacare, and tax credits. After 5 years, they become eligible to receive Medicaid, SNAP, TANF, Federal Student Aid, and SSI, which is the Social Security Supplemental Security Income, which I will note, citizens with developmental and intellectual disabilities, are critically reliant on SSI. So now you have people who are otherwise inadmissible to the United States, who do not have a lawful immigration status. Parole is not an immigration status. It's an entry permission. Also being eligible for all those benefits. However, as the director of FAIR noted in her testimony, Cuban and Haitian parolees, people who are paroled in who are Cuban and Haitian, are exempt from that 5-year waiting period, meaning that once they're paroled in, they're immediately eligible for this entire menu of public benefits.
That's just like the refugees. Refugees show up eligible for pretty much everything.
That's exactly right. So to make matters worse, if you will, or to give you an idea of the scope of the problem with regard to Biden's gross abuse of the parole authority. In 2023, and very early 2023, the Biden administration announced that it would use what is supposed to be the very limited use of parole. It's a very limited authority. Again, supposed to be given on a case-by-case basis, meaning per individual, that they intended to annually admit up to 360,000 Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelan nationals using this parole authority. So the director of FAIR further commented, and I'm just going to quote her because she said it better than I ever could. She said, quote, "Parole has become a shadow immigration system. It is essentially supplanting the family and employment-based systems. They've created a completely separate system for hundreds of thousands of people who have no legal basis to enter this country," unquote. Well, nevertheless, going back to the Tennessee 2022 law that had been sponsored by Republican Shane Reeves and Democrat Bob Freeman.
One thing, right there, okay, when it's bipartisan, we know it's bad. I mean, that should have been like the first clue that they're doing a bill with Bob Freeman. And I just was surprised, disgusted that this could pass, no matter what was said, because it was obvious to most people that, hey, this was a bad idea. You're given a professional license. That means a professional license could include things like a law license, so you could then be an immigration lawyer or doctor, whatever the case may be. But that's just rewarding these people. The more you reward illegal immigration, the more of it you get.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and that's really, the more that we normalize things like, normalize unlawful immigration status, the more we undermine the few federal laws that are really designed to disincentivize illegal immigration. What are we left with? And I also think that, Republicans cannot have it both ways. They can't turn to us and say, yeah, I'm opposed to illegal immigration, and then enact state laws that actually undermine the federal immigration laws. Yep. You have to decide, how are you going to proceed? And yeah, it may be, you may have a very heartfelt want to help an individual who's got a sympathetic story, but you're not there, as a lawmaker. You're there to look at what is good policy for the state. And we should be demanding that Congress do its job. I think certainly as to the DACA program in particular, Obama put that program in place in June of 2012. Since then, Congress has never opted to give DACA recipients any kind of lawful immigration status. They've not chosen to do it. And there's been tons of advocacy, and goodness knows how much money and effort has been spent advocating for basically giving a form of amnesty to DACA. Congress has not chosen to do that. So it's really not up to the state to step in and do Congress's job in that regard. That's just my opinion.
You have to be illegal to be DACA. To qualify to be DACA,
That's
you have to be illegal, correct?
Yes, in order to qualify for DACA, you have to be able to demonstrate that you did not have any lawful immigration status prior to the enactment by Obama of this program. Yeah, that is absolutely true. So, again, going back to that 2022 law that we had, all those parolees that I just talked about would have been eligible to access the state issued commercial and professional licenses. So, the sometimes things happen legislatively because of the context or the environment or what's happening around us politically. And I think that, what has happened, I think there were several factors at play in the 2024 session. I think it was the AG joining these multi-state lawsuits. I think it's a re-election year for a number of our legislators, state senators in particular, who have a trail of bad immigration-related votes behind them. I'm going to actually get a little more specific about that. And I think that there may even have been some understanding that what they were told at the outset about this bill maybe was not entirely accurate. And given that, all I can say is maybe it would leave people with a healthy dose of skepticism the next time some of these lobbyists come around with immigration-related bills. And I also think that I would encourage more of our legislators. I think they vote on these bills without really having a full appreciation of the implications of what some of these bills are going to do. But FAIR, the Immigration Reform Law Institute, Center for Immigration Studies, these are incredible think tank organizations, and some that do litigation, but these are staffed with lawyers. This is all they do. They know this stuff better than anybody. And if a legislator, in fact, FAIR has a whole department that is just state and local engagement, has lawyers in it, and they are happy to help state legislators either really understand what a bill might do, good or not so good,
Right.
or improve those bills, or even help them draft legislation if they want to, try and do something.
Yeah, and we have a slide that has, I think, those organizations that you mentioned. If we could pop that up there, and we can leave it up for a little while. This is good for citizens. It's good for legislators, and legislators should not just be taking our legal department's word for it, okay, or even their colleagues' word for it, because they can be honestly misled, or they could be not so honestly misled. Whatever the case, these are agencies, these are references that they can go to, and they'll gladly help them and tell them the effect of whatever the proposed law is. So we're just going to leave that slide up there for a little bit, but you continue, please.
So last year, Florida's Attorney General, Ashley Moody, who I have tremendous respect for, so she repealed a 2014 law that had been passed in Florida that permitted DACA recipients to get a license to practice law in the state. Okay. Well, she repealed that. And, when I started to think about that, I thought, wow, if you were a DACA recipient, somebody who does not have a lawful immigration status, and you were able to get a Florida law license, I can't definitively answer the question I'm going to pose, but there are many states, Tennessee included, that offer reciprocity to law licenses from other states. And so my question would sort of be, well, if you're a DACA recipient who gets a law license in Florida, and you apply for reciprocity, meaning Tennessee would grant you a Tennessee law. You would be able to waive into the Tennessee bar and get a Tennessee law license. Well, could they do that? Our state Supreme Court is the one that decides. They set the rules for who can get a law license in Tennessee, and there are no citizenship requirements to get a law license in Tennessee.
Wow.
So, these are some interesting and troubling questions. In any case, this year, Tennessee Senator Kerry Roberts, he led the way in Tennessee, and he repealed the 2022 law, and he restored our Tennessee law to what it was before. So now the Tennessee law that applies to all Tennessee state and local public benefits, which includes commercial and professional licenses, you have to be either a U.S. citizen or a qualified alien as defined in federal law. And he did add one, and that was the original language prior to the passage of the 2022 bill. But he did add one little clarifier, and that was because our law does use that term lawfully present, which is in federal law, but it's not, it doesn't mean what it's been taken to mean. So, however, the way he used it as a clarifier, he said lawfully present as defined or pursuant to the Immigration and Nationality Act. That is the controlling federal law. And that is a really important distinction, and one that I hope, I'm going to actually talk about that in a second, but hope to add some clarification for our legislators if they take the time to read it and understand it, and read how our code in this particular section on the state public benefits is designed to be read. So one of the problems that Senator Roberts understood about the 2022 law is that it was actually preempted by the controlling federal law. So the federal law says it's a specific federal law that deals with state and local public benefits. Well, it specifically defines what is a state or local public benefit, and it specifically includes commercial and professional licenses. It also includes in-state tuition. It's a state public benefit.
Another one they keep trying to give away.
Yes, they do. I'm going to actually give you a little history about that. I think it's a very important history lesson, because you know what they say, if you don't know your history, you're going to just repeat it. So the federal law, which defines state and local benefit very specifically, doesn't leave the state any authority to redefine it, which is exactly the way the 2022 law was written. So, this reference in the law to lawfully present, there's a lot of confusion that I hear from state legislators who don't understand that just possessing a work permit, it has no direct correlation to having a lawful immigration status, meaning that having a temporary work author, all the work authorization is temporary. It's always temporary, of certain duration. It does not provide anybody a lawful immigration status, period. Just doesn't. So I think that is something that legislators have got to really start understanding. The two are not equivalent.
It doesn't provide it, and it's not required to get that temporary authorization.
That's exactly right. You do not have to be you don't have to be lawfully, or have a lawful immigration status in order to get a work permit. That's exactly correct. And I would say to this point specifically, so there was another bill passed by House Member Gino Bolso and Senator Joey Hensley. That's HB 1907, SB 1866. And that is if our legislators take the time to understand it, and it was passed heartily, except Democrats voted against it. But what that does is it redefines the term illegal alien that is currently in the state's E-Verify statute. And the way it rewords that is to distinguish very clearly between immigration status and work authorization or work status, the ability to work. So the point is is exactly as we just said. There are many groups like DACA, for example. They do not have a lawful immigration status, but they do have work authorization and they are allowed to work. I think the other thing that's concerning, kind of what I mentioned before, I'm not sure that the 2022 amendment that Senator Roberts used to restore the benefits law in Tennessee, I'm not sure it would have passed last year when the situation with the parolees was kind of new. There weren't the same, factors where we are this year. And you weren't as close to a reelection
Yeah,
year. So I
absolutely.
think that, yeah. So I'm not I can't say confidently that if these legislators who voted for in-state tuition bills for DACA,
Yeah,
Farrell Hale, Becky Massey, many of these legislators, especially in the Senate, who voted for those bills in 2015 and then voted for the licensing law in 2022, if they're reelected, I don't know that, and they come back for 4 years. I'm not sure that they wouldn't necessarily get more comfortable going back to their prior vote profiles, let's say. So I think that that's, something to keep in mind when they've all got primary opponents. I think they've got formidable primary opponents, and I think maybe it's time for a change to maybe give Tennessee a chance to reverse course on some things and maybe strengthen, especially if the 2024 election doesn't, if Trump's not elected. I mean,
yeah,
then we're in a really more dire situation, and it's really going to take a strong state legislature to
yeah,
do everything you can at the state level. But just going back to what you said, I mean, I'm always confounded that our legislators vote for bills like the past in-state tuition bills, the 2022 bill, when they're told that it's specifically to benefit DACA grantees. I mean, that I just cannot understand. It's just as you said, in order to be eligible for DACA, you have to show you never had a lawful immigration status before Obama unilaterally put that program in place. And even USIS, the U.S. Citizen and Immigration Service, specifically says deferred action does not confer any lawful immigration status. There was a case out of Georgia in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. And it actually dealt with DACA, was an in-state tuition case. And this is the U.S. 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. And they said very specifically, quote, given that here DACA, what DACA is that they are given a reprieve from potential removal. That does not mean they are in any way lawfully present under the Immigration and Nationality Act. The Immigration and Nationality Act, which was passed by Congress in 1952, that is the law that determines the status, the immigration status of all non-citizens that enter the United States. And it provides that if you're here in violation of the INA, you are removable. So, I don't know how many ways to say it, but our legislators have got to finally understand that when they legislate to benefit DACA specifically,
yep,
this is somebody that has no lawful immigration status, and DACA, the grant of deferred deportation, is not an immigration status. I would also reiterate, I mean, I also don't understand why they would want to prop up or otherwise endorse a unlawful program put in place by Obama and then sort of concurrently reinforced by Biden while they're objecting to Biden's immigration programs and policies, right?
yeah,
And in fact, Biden's DHS issued a final rule on DACA, which was basically a reiteration of the rule that was put in place under Obama. And it specifically said as to lawful presence, because that's what our legislators keep honing in on is lawful presence, as if that actually means something in terms of immigration status, which it doesn't. But the Biden rule in
That's a
2020,
policy. That's a policy. And the law is what dictates, not a presidential policy. But here, our legislature, while they're complaining about what the Biden administration is doing, and rightfully so, they're actually undercutting what they say they believe in.
yeah, it is a grossly inconsistent position. But even the Biden administration's DHS has said that lawful presence is just a specialized term of art distinct from lawful status. They make it really clear. DACA are otherwise inadmissible aliens subject to removal, and they do not possess a lawful immigration status under the INA. So, I was talking about the 2015, it kind of started in earnest in 2015 with these in-state tuition bills.
Yep.
Mark White in the House, Todd Gardenhire in the Senate. Gardenhire actually had another in-state tuition bill in 2023. It didn't go anywhere. He didn't move it. He didn't bring it to committee. But I actually think it's going to come back. I mean, they keep trying and trying and trying. And, they kind of use this argument that, well, the state has invested so much money in the education of these students that why are we going to let all of that investment in their education go to waste and not let them go to college on in-state tuition? Well, they say that, but without recognizing or acknowledging, yeah, you're being forced by the federal government to do that.
Yep.
But there's a difference. We, whatever regardless of the objection to the Supreme Court decision that drives that mandatory K-12 education, once you get to in-state tuition, once you get to higher ed, that is a state public benefit. It is in a whole different category. It's not even comparable to K-12. So that's why legislators have got to understand this, because they're going to continue to be faced with these public benefits type bills. Let's see.
I do want to say something. It does seem to me that, the GOP seems to, way too many of them, support this kind of stuff. And of course, I think that has to do with, that's what the NFIB, Chamber of Commerce, and others support. They support the cheap labor. But the Democrats support this too. So this is bipartisan. And like I said earlier, when it's bipartisan, we know that we're getting it from both parties, and it's usually not a good thing. So there's plenty of blame to go around. But hey, really, we're a Republican supermajority. Nothing gets through. Think about it. The House sponsor was a Democrat.
Yeah. I mean, I think at best, if a bill like that comes, it may require much more careful review and a little bit more skepticism as to actually what is it going to do? What's the implication of it? What's the actual application of it? And to look at it very, very carefully, because I think we ultimately undermine ourselves. And I think the other thing to remember is some of it is gratuitous. People who come with work authorization are allowed to work. And I'm certainly not sitting here saying they can't work. I mean, that is outside the jurisdiction of a state government. And that's a different problem that has to be fixed by Congress. But I think that's where the state has to make some decisions about how much they're going to sort of abet an agenda that ultimately undermines federal law that we need and that could, if applied, and that's one of the big criticisms about the Biden administration, is that they're absolutely not following the federal law. I would say, for example, in 2021, the federal district court in Texas ruled in a 70-plus page opinion that the DACA program put in place by Obama was procedurally and substantively invalid and in violation of federal immigration law. A year later, our state legislature, and that was affirmed by the U.S. Court of Appeals of the Fifth Circuit, and a year later, our legislature, our Republicans turn around
Yep.
and provide this benefit, very far-reaching benefit for those same beneficiaries of a program that is directly in violation of federal law. So for me, I can't quite make that match up. I think that it's just grossly inconsistent. And I think it harms the credibility. I think for us as voters, it really diminishes the credibility of some of what our Republican legislators tell us in terms of their positions on immigration related matters. Anyway, but I think there are some things, looking forward to 2025, whether in defense of a bad result in 2024, or even if Trump is elected and has 4 years to maybe act on some of this and see what he can put back in place or fix. I think there are things that the state there are things that the state should consider, are worth considering.
I do have a question from a listener.
Sure.
Were you able to hear that? Oh, okay.
No, I can't.
Basically, the question is, Trump has said he'll deport all the illegals. Do you think that's a feasible plan, that will actually happen, or happen on any great scale?
I mean, I think it depends what he means by that. Okay. So I don't know. What's the mechanism? I'm not sure what the mechanism is for doing that. I don't know if it's not renewing work permits. I mean, look, it is universally recognized that the work opportunities are that is the magnet. There's no question. If you can't work, in fact, that's some of the argument being used by Democrats in some of the cities that are being overrun with, the folks that Biden is bringing in from the border, and they want the people to be able to work. So they want to accelerate when how fast the work permits can be issued. They want to extend the duration of the work permits. I mean, and those are all kind of, I think, treacherous waters, because once you start monkeying with that, then you're creating non-permanent continuances. So, it's kind of like homesteading. I mean, that's how I've always thought of it. It's like kind of the longer you stay, you get married, you have a kid here. I mean, you compounded the problem of what do you really do about what Biden has done, and he's it's millions of people. So I think I don't know what Trump's plan is. He certainly hasn't been more specific about it. But I think if we take any sort of message away from his prior term as president, I think what he does have, he knows the right people to bring into his administration to start figuring this out. They probably will come. I think they'll come in with very specific plans about what they're going to do. Again, I don't know. I'm pretty simplistic about it. I think, well, what if you don't renew the work authorization? Because you know who has it. And if you don't have work authorization, then you've got some leverage. You've got, you have a way to. The other thing that I'm actually going to talk about is, so the Biden administration announced they're going to pilot a program of ID cards. And this is supposedly to take the place of the paper documents that they are giving people that they are bringing in from the border, so that they can kind of keep track of them. And they are saying that these cards, these identification cards, they're not supposed to be recognized as official federal identification documents. Okay. Well,
Are they official bad policy documents? What are they?
They're picture cards. They're like a photo ID card. Okay.
Good Lord.
So, okay. But here's kind of the interesting question I think that it raises. And it goes back for me to a law that we passed in 2018, the municipal ID law. Bobby Petray worked on this as well. She lobbied this as well. And so William Lamberth carried it in the House, and Mark Green carried it in the Senate. And I think Tennessee was really kind of ahead of the curve on this, because what we were seeing going on in some other cities is that other cities were starting to issue municipal identification cards for people who were not able to get state issued IDs, right? The reason they weren't able to get state issued IDs is because they weren't here legally, okay?
Yeah.
So this bill was designed to prohibit local jurisdictions from creating and issuing their own local ID cards.
Right.
Interestingly, during the House State Government Committee hearing, two leaders from Turk came to testify. And let me back up. I'm sorry. There was one important element to the bill. The bill also prohibited the use of a consular card to be used as identification. And the thinking was that, well, you can't use a consular card as identification to get a Tennessee driver's license. That's in our driver license statute. So it made sense that you wouldn't be able to use a consular card for ID for any other purposes.
Right.
So the two reps from Turk came and testified in committee, and they said, and of course they testified against the bill, and they said that, the people that primarily rely on the use of the consular card are people who do not have immigration status. That's like a direct quote. I went back and looked it up, okay? And they also informed the committee that the Mexican consulate visits Tennessee monthly to issue its consular cards. Now that's back in 2018. I don't even know what it is now. So, if you stop and think about that, the Mexican consulate was coming once a month to issue consular cards. And so, and like Catholic Charities at the time in certain cities was running its own municipal ID card program. Anyway, so Lamberth passed the bill totally as it was written. Okay, no problem. But in the Senate, when there was a Senate majority, there was Republican opposition to prohibiting the use of the consular card, and Senator Green agreed to amend it out of his bill. So it got down to that bill went back and forth between the House and the Senate. And then, and I agree with the decision that was finally made to finally concur, because it was important to get the bigger objective, which was to get ahead and prohibit the start of municipal ID card programs. So the law was passed. It does not have the prohibition on the consular card, but I started thinking, in light of what Biden is doing with his
Who needs a consular card?
His pilot card, well, because they're saying that it's not an official form of federal identification, well, then it shouldn't be accepted as an official form of state, identification at the state level. So I think it's worth going back into that 2018 law, putting the consular card prohibition back in, and also figuring out how to word some reference to disregard the use of this federal ID card, which the Biden administration is saying is not an official form of federal identification. So I think that's a worthy pursuit. All I can tell you is, if Representative William Lamberth would carry that card again, I'd have him do it. You could go back and watch his defending that bill and promoting that bill. And, he was so articulate and so on point and totally understands the need for it. So, I'd love to see him carried again. I'm not sure, we don't know who's going to be in the Senate. Not sure who would carry it in the Senate, but anyway,
Yeah, we only have a handful of senators that will carry things like that, unfortunately. And that and any pretty much good conservative bill, we don't have too many choices. Just to clarify, and this was the question, going back to the earlier question, does Trump have the authority legally, though, just to do a mass deportation? Is there any reason he couldn't if he chose to, whether it's practical or not, whether it's, how you go about it, but he does have the authority to do that, correct?
Well, I mean, I think I'm not exactly sure how to answer that question, simply because, okay, you've got are you talking about like the parolees? Okay, you've got all these lawsuits that are in play. I don't know what's going to come out of the courts, and meanwhile you got all these people. So I don't know. I mean, I don't think you can just go around with like the National Guard picking people up off the street. I don't know how you really find people. And I think it's a relatively complicated question, but I think his intent, if you look at what his intent is to address this mass of people who are otherwise inadmissible to the United States that Biden has brought into the United States. I think that there are folks that worked with Trump before who are absolutely, to me, some of the most well-informed and the most experienced. I mean, I've been to conferences where these people have spoken. Mark Morgan, in fact, has been to Tennessee twice and spoken here, maybe 3 times, actually. He's been here 3 times at different conferences. I mean, these are people who've got years of ground level experience at the border, in the administration. I think they have the best insights as to how to effectuate what Trump is proposing. But if you kind of look behind what he's saying, look, we have to do something about what have been the actions taken by the Biden administration to bring people in who really are otherwise inadmissible. They never should have been here in the first place. How you go about that is well above my pay grade, but yeah. But I think Trump, look, let's put it this way. As between Trump and Biden, who's going to make an earnest effort to accomplish?
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
you mentioned the courts, and of course they've been a part of the problem. The whole Plyler-Doe decision back in '82, I believe it was. That's why we're forced to educate the children of illegal aliens, if I'm understanding that correctly. And so, now, of course, me, I'm like, we should just ignore that. But if nothing else, we should challenge it in court and stop just accepting, that we have to take on all these children that are here illegally, because once you get them in school, I mean, that is a cost on the community. You got the whole ELL cost, and I don't know what the current numbers are on the ELL.
I can give you the last numbers that I have, because I used to be able to track it. I had some help from folks in the legislature who could access the data, but I only went up to fiscal year 2021. So in fiscal year 2021, ELL, that's English Language Learner Services, which, by the way, are predominantly paid by state and local governments. We get the mandate from the feds, who only put in a tiny little bit of money, and it's mostly state and local money. So in fiscal year 2021, it was 143.7 million for state and 68 million local. And what you can't necessarily appreciate, I probably should have given you to put it up on the screen, but if you look at the trend, I mean, the trend is pretty dramatic. So, the levels the numbers were quite low. The expenditures were quite low for quite a long time. And then all of a sudden started climbing, but jumped by a lot. So I can't even imagine what it is now. I have no idea. I don't have access to that data anymore, but it's a lot of money.
I was listening to the radio this morning, and Scott Sapicki was on, and he was talking about this topic, and he said they're getting so many kids in, and of course they can't speak English, and they're all thrown in the school system. Well, I'm sure they don't have enough ELL instructors to cover a big influx, especially all at once that you're not prepared for. So that, that just takes more time from the teachers. We've got all this other garbage going on, a lot of it from the Biden administration. But, just the day-to-day life in the school, and now you have all these additional kids thrown on you who can't speak English. And our state just has to push back on that kind of stuff. We have to say no, in my opinion. But that's another cost. And of course, we're hearing the same thing about health care. I'm sure we're putting at least a few more of them in our prisons that cost as well. So like you said, it's a federal policy that we end up as states and cities and counties paying for.
And actually, there was a bill passed this session. I don't have the number with me, but it's requiring the DA conference to establish a publicly accessible website with certain data related to people who are arrested and their immigration status. And I think it's the same thing for all of these costs. Like ELL, the state has the numbers. I think it should be posted in a publicly accessible format so that we can look at it. I think we have a right to know. But it's hard for me to get that data. So I think that it should be publicly posted and accessible. I am concerned. I think what's happening in Tennessee, it's becoming less transparent.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's, my personal opinion is, I don't think that's good government.
Yeah. Speaking of transparency and funding, what about Catholic Charities and the $7.3 million grant that they received from our state? As if everything wasn't bad enough. Now
Right.
our state gave them money. Now this was a few years ago, but the grant spans a few years. So
Yeah.
what do you know on that? What can you
Well,
fill us in?
so in 2020, the Tennessee Department of Human Services they were dealing with a bloated TANF fund, that's temporary assistance for needy families. And so they gave a $7.3 million grant to Catholic Charities of Tennessee. I don't know. I've always wondered if it was a competitive grant or they just picked Catholic Charities for I don't know what reason, but Catholic Charities it's Catholic Charities of Tennessee. They were the big winner. And that grant was designed or has been designed to have Catholic Charities expand its infrastructure in the form of family resource centers into 10 Middle Tennessee counties where they really don't have a presence, and that is Montgomery, Murray, Marshall, Bedford, Coffee, Grundy, Warren, White, DeKalb, and Putnam counties.
Wow.
It was, I had seen the grant application, and it was for something called second generation poverty. Well, I think that I would love to see a really good audit of that grant. I'd like to see the populations that they're serving, because that's a pretty wide open description of, who qualifies. I do think they probably have to be eligible for TANF. That would be my guess, because it is TANF money. But again, what are the they
don't have to be a citizen.
Right. I don't know. I don't know if you have to be. I don't know, because the money's now coming through Catholic Charities. Does it still retain certain restrictions on who's eligible for that money? It's unknown. But that's why I think it would be great to have a really good audit that asks some pertinent questions and, informs us about what happened to that money and how it's being used. The other question becomes, it's like, okay, is there going to be more money that follows? Now that you've got these resource centers supposedly set up, then what? How do you pay for the staffing of that? How do you pay for, I don't know, whatever. I don't know if they're going to be encouraging people to register to vote.
Probably.
Okay. But I also want to go back. So there was a bill this session. It didn't pass. It was Brent Taylor and Jody Barrett. Brent Taylor in the Senate and Jody Barrett in the House. They had a driver license bill. And I think this is really an important bill to reconsider. Again, just my personal opinion. And I think too, when just because the bill didn't pass is not a reason to not go back, relook at it, see what people were concerned about, what were the objections. Sometimes you're in a session and stuff gets thrown at a bill, and there really isn't sufficient time to try to amend it or figure out what you have to do, and I don't really know what the driving circumstances were, but the bill didn't pass. But I would love to see them go back and reconsider this and figure out how to fine tune the bill to get it past and we don't know, of course, who's coming back, but to get it to the point where maybe they will pass it. But here's what I thought was important about it. So if you go on the Tennessee Department of Safety website to see, well, who can get a real ID driver's license? And you may recall Tennessee waited a long time to become real ID compliant. But when my recollection is when real ID driver's licenses were being touted, it was all about, these are for U.S. citizens. Like you're going to know, if you're a U.S. citizen, you get a real ID. Okay. Yeah. Real ID driver's license, get you on a plane, federal buildings, the whole thing. Well, if you go on the Tennessee Department of Safety website now to see who can get a real ID driver's license, people who have work authorization can get a real ID Tennessee driver's license. Lord. They can also get a regular Tennessee driver's license. I mean, they do have to, provide the documentation to show that they're residents, but they're eligible to get a Tennessee real ID driver's license. Okay. So, when you think about that, and also, of course, I immediately start thinking about our voter ID law, because voter ID law says that photo identification in the form of a Tennessee driver's license. Right? All right.
It's a vicious circle.
Well, there are potential loopholes, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But I think, supposedly these are these real ID Tennessee driver's licenses that are issued on the basis of work authorization and proof of residence, of being a resident of Tennessee, are supposed to be marked somewhere, somehow, to indicate that they are temporary licenses. I think there's a potential gap between that and what people who work the polls know when they're presented with a photo Tennessee driver's license, okay? But interestingly, Virginia does not accept work authorization as proof of legal presence for a real ID. So I think, there's something to look at. I don't think Tennessee, the real ID statute does not require the issuance of real ID. And in fact, I actually looked this up, but TSA will accept work authorization in order to be able to board a plane. So let's say you have a regular driver's license.
Right.
You can still board the plane if you have work authorization. And actually, if you just came over the border, you don't even have to have any identification, and they're apparently letting you board the plane. Okay, that's a whole other.
We're actually, I hate this, but we're going to have to cut this short. I'd love to have you back on. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for all the things you do behind the scenes. I really appreciate you. We do have one last question though.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, well, I'm just going to ask you one easy question and let you go. What's the final solution? That's one of the questions I got. What's the solution to this?
Yeah. Okay. Don't ever talk to me about final solution.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Has other implications.
I got you. I got you.
But no. I think again, it's a number of these individual measures. I would love to see a remittance bill passed in Tennessee. And
good point.
Look, we tried twice. It was voted down by a Republican super-majority. But if you would see the numbers on money that permanently leaves the Tennessee economy in remittances, we're crazy not to do it. There's no reason not to.
Yep.
It's hard to understand why the legislature is so resistant. But I think if people like yourself, I mean, other activists. I mean, I've met great people around the state of Tennessee. I've traveled around the state of Tennessee. I've talked to lots of different people and lots of groups. And I think people are well informed and very motivated. And, I think that there are these measures that should be taken because I think it's a lot of steps that when you kind of look at the whole picture, I mean, Tennessee, you can be welcoming, but you don't have to
Be
reward.
stupid.
I mean, people have work authorization, they're allowed to work, okay? But then there are limits to what you put in place
Yep.
to elevate that. So, I think some of the things we've talked about, I think we do have, I'm hoping that we see some of these good, strong legislators who I think have a much better understanding of these issues.
Yep.
They just need more of them.
Yep.
So it's an imperfect answer, but it's the condition of the state government
Absolutely.
that we.
Hey, thanks once again for coming on. Appreciate it. We'll
Thank you for
definitely have you
having
back.
me.
I want to thank everybody for taking the time to watch our program tonight. Please be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons as well as the notification bell so you never miss a show. Please visit our website, tninformer.com, to sign up for weekly newsletters. You can follow us on Facebook or Twitter at TNInformer. Share us with your friends. Next Thursday at 7 p.m. Central this Thursday at 7 p.m. Central, you'll see part 2 of our interview with retired FBI agent David Baldwin, based on his article, The FBI's Ordinary Men. Our guest on the 20th will be Tiffany Boyd of freeyourchildren.com, a private education advocacy organization dedicated to preserving parental, educational, and constitutional rights. That'll be from 7 to 8 p.m., followed by Chris Morris, SEC member, who will discuss the very hot topic of bona fide Republican candidates. That's it for now. Good night from Paris, Tennessee, that is.